Right. Saturday morning day texts. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me so that we can continue our progressive readings through the biblical books. As you know, we finished up the New Testament books that we considered not too long ago, and we just started our readings in the book of Genesis, where we're reading the translations that I've done of the Greek and Hebrew texts that tell us about these things. So we've considered several items already. We talked about the beginning, and we talked about the creation of life, the condition of the earth at the time in the beginning when it was made, that it was without any clear structure, dark, and with water covering the surfaces. Then light came into being, either as light coming from Jah or as a result of his creation of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so these are conditions that the book of Genesis describes before there is a sun or a moon shining upon the earth. So we're in the early stages of the descriptions of the creation described by Genesis. And so again, at this point, we have the earth that has no clear structure, unlike what we see today when we consider the surface of the earth. There's a wind from God, darkness over the watery surfaces until light comes into being, at which time there is now a separation between light and darkness. And Jah calls the light day. And the coupling of light and darkness during this period in Genesis is called the first day, or day one, like the Greek text translates it. Now we're going to get into some additional descriptions involving other things that are made at this period of time. And it often confuses people. Today's reading, I've seen so many interesting, I'll say, interpretations of some of these texts. And yet, I don't see any reason for any confusion at all. And I think you'll see what I'm referring to as we get going into these texts. But basically, some of the key issues we're going to focus in on today involve the placement of the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the separation that Jah made between the waters on the surface of the earth and waters that come to be above the surface of the earth. So those are some of the issues that we're going to discuss today, as well as some views that people have of some of these texts. I mean, you can get anything from people believing in flat earth to people who just can't make sense of the expanse that God creates here, and that is described as creating a division between the waters above and below. Even though we have clouds today that carry water above the earth all the time. It's just not as much water as the Bible describes early on as being over the earth, above the waters on the earth. And so for whatever reason, it seems like people just forget that we have millions and millions of pounds of water floating above our heads. Let's take a look at the text and then we'll talk about it. Okay, Genesis chapter 1. We're going to be reading verses 6 through 8. I'm going to read the Hebrew text and then the Greek text of each verse. And I'm going to probably keep going through the reading, and then we'll go back through it and talk about some of these things. You're free to post questions as well. Just try to keep them on point related to the material. Genesis 1:6, Hebrew translation, or translation of the Hebrew text. Then God began to say, a firm expanse must come to be in the middle of the waters, and it must come about to separate a space between waters according to water types. We know today we have ocean water and we have fresh water. And we know that water that is that become through the condensation process and that is brought up into the clouds doesn't come down to us as the same water that it goes up into the clouds as. They're different types of water. Even way back then, in this time, they could see that and understood it, just like we should be able to see today. Again, as I said at the start, it's really not that confusing if you just look at it in light of what actually exists today. All right, Greek translation, Genesis 1:6. Then God said, a firm expanse must come to be in the middle of the water, and it must exist so as to cause a separation between water and other water. So it came about just like that. And so you have now, imagine a mass of water, all the water covering the earth, just like we read about in yesterday's day text reading of verses 2 through 5. So all that water is over the earth. Now that water, which is one body of water covering the earth, is divided or sectioned off in terms of different types of water. That is, water that will be above the separation and water below the separation. Verse 7, Hebrew translation. Then God began to make the firm expanse and to separate a space between the waters, which are from below the firm expanse, and the waters which are from above the firm expanse. So it came about just like that. Greek translation, Genesis 1:7. Then God made the firm expanse, and God made a separation between the water which was below the firm expanse and the water above the firm expanse. So again, we see the same thing basically being stated, that God is acting upon what is described in verse 6, and a space is created between waters. Waters above the space and waters below the space. Just like we have today. It rains all over the earth. There's water above waters on the earth today. Millions of pounds of water floating above our heads. We'll talk about it in a moment. But I get people who bring up things like gravity and weight, and they haven't even made a scientific inquiry. They haven't even looked into it yet. It just seems impossible to them. Well, you seem like a retard to me. But I don't just go with that, right? I check you out, I find out what's going on, and then I determine whether or not you're retarded, or you're just a normal person who's not learned enough yet to understand these basic things. So, just because something seems impossible, or someone seems like a retard, that doesn't mean that's what it is. You actually have to investigate, right? And provide data and information. If you're going to make an idiotic comment, like that much water above the earth would be too heavy and gravity would pull it down. I mean, we don't have time to go over the basics of science with people unless you're maybe 12 years old or younger. Then that's okay, But if you're 13 years old or more, and you're asking questions about how that much water could be above the earth and not fall down because of gravity, we can't help you. You're not in a condition where we're going to be able to assist you. You need to go back and fundamentally come to an understanding of life and science and what's really going on around us. Then these ancient texts won't confuse you so much. Verse 8. Or did I read verse 7 of the Greek? Let me do it anyway. Then God made the firm expanse. God made a separation between the water, which was below the firm expanse, and the water above the firm expanse, just like we see today. Verse 8, Genesis 1. God began to call the firm expanse sky heavens. This is very important. They're all important, but this is extremely important comparatively because of the point I'm going to make once we're done. God began to call the firm expanse sky heavens, Hebrew text. Then there came to be a time for darkness and a time for light. This time for light was the second day. We discussed the days of creation in our last day text video for verses 2 through 5. So take a look at that if you want more information about the 24-hour day cycle. And we will talk about it again in some upcoming texts as we get to the luminaries that are brought forth by John. Greek translation, Genesis 1:8. Then God called the firm expanse sky heaven, and God saw that it was good. So there came to be a time for darkness and a time for light. This time of light was a second day. Okay, so what's going on here, right? This firm expanse, okay, we've already related it to the conditions that exist today, which is appropriate. I mean, that's essentially very similar to how the Bible in Psalm 145, I'm going to go ahead and read it to you because I've clipped it here. In Psalm 148, notice what it says. Okay, we just described a separation that exists in Genesis between waters above the firm expanse and waters below the firm expanse. And the firm expanse is called sky heavens. Okay, so in Genesis 1:1, God made the heavens and the earth, right? Right. What is sky heavens? It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the heavens in Genesis 1:1 with the expanse, with the atmosphere in place. It's the same heavens. It's just now called sky heavens. Why? Because God just made the sky. He just created the atmospheric expanse in which there are waters above the waters below the expanse. But the expanse is not just this place between the cloud layer water and the waters on the earth. It's everything, all the way up into space. It's just that because the cloud layer is put above the expanse part which separates it, that's why it's described as above the expanse. It is. The clouds are above the separation made between the waters on the earth and the waters in heaven. Psalm 148:1 says, "Praise Jah, you people. Praise Jehovah from the heavens." I'm reading NWT. "Praise him in the heights. Praise him, all you angels. Praise him, all you his army." Verse 3, "Praise him, you sun and moon. Praise him, all you stars of light." 148:4, "Praise him, you heavens of the heavens, and you waters that are above the heavens." Psalm 148:4, even at that time, that is post-flood, they were referring to waters above the heavens. It's the same thing as what was in existence at the time God made these waters above the expanse and above the surface waters. There's just more. There's more watery cloud layers. That's why it says in Genesis, when the flood comes, it rained. What does rain come from? Clouds. The waters above the expanse that separates the waters on the surface of the earth and the cloud layer waters are clouds full of water, just like we see today, but less of it, because the water that Jah originally put above the expanse that separates the surface waters and the heavenly waters, that water has come down, most of it. That's why we see ice caps. That's why we have so much water under the surface of the earth, more water under the surface of the earth than in the oceans. We'll talk about that when we get to the flood. And yet I still get just dumb questions by people who don't research. They don't. They present questions for us to research, and we just read the text. Right? It's very obvious what's being discussed here. In Genesis 1:1, when the heavens are made, they're not sky heavens. right? In Genesis 1:1, God makes the heavens and the earth. But he has not created sky heaven. He has not made an expanse to separate the waters above and below. Right? Right. Because in order to do that, to create waters above the earth, he created the atmosphere, which allows for the conditions that lead to evaporation, condensation, and water in the clouds. That was not happening in Genesis 1:1. The waters were simply all over the surface. There was no expansive atmosphere. There were no waters above the waters on the earth. Now there is. So the heavens that God made in Genesis 1:1 are now sky heavens. In other words, when we look up, we're looking into the heavens, starting with the lower level where we are. Then you have mid-heaven, right? Because it's Revelation, I think it's text in Revelation 19 where it says that the birds are flying in mid-heaven. You have an angel standing in the sun, and then the birds, he's calling out to the birds in mid-heaven. There's different levels of heaven, but it's all the expanse. It's the firm expanse that allows for clouds to hang up high, whereas before they could not. In the heavens that God made in the beginning, that was not constructed to have clouds or a layer of water in the sky. It wasn't even fit for birds to fly in the sky. That's what he's making here. Sky heavens. Remember, the sun isn't even here yet. The moon, if it's there, it's not shining yet because there's no light, at least in terms of the moon being a source of light. The electromagnetic spectrum or Jaws light exists, but it's not, the luminaries have not been brought forth. What we have, and the reason for that is obvious scientifically. Let's take a look. So when you're looking at light, what are we really seeing? Where's that light coming from? Well, let's take a look at a couple things so we can better understand some of these issues, and then we'll get back to the text. Okay, so let's take a look here together at this. There's an answer, a question: what happens to light from the sun when it hits other planets on Quora? And this answer here I thought was useful. It summarizes it well enough for us to then move forward from to a couple other quotes. Notice what Gary Nichols, optics, spectroscopy, astronomy, and astrophysics answered with respect to what happens to light from the sun when it hits other planets. It must be recognized there is no visible light or heat emanating from the sun. Only shorter wavelength light is emitted by the sun, and only when that invisible to our eyes light interacts with the atmosphere of a planet or moon is visible light created. If a planet or moon has no atmosphere, then it will appear very dark. What did Genesis 1:1 say? Darkness covered the surface of the watery deep. Why? No sky heavens. No sky heavens yet. And that's exactly what this professor or scientist states would be true. If there's no atmosphere, it will appear very dark. As with Mercury, and there will be some visible light emitted by solar radiation, but that wouldn't have been existing at the time of Genesis because the solar radiation wasn't happening yet. Interaction with the top few microns of the surface material. This light will be very weak though, so spectrographic instruments are required to detect it. This is why there are no visible light images of Mercury using a regular camera. It's just too dark, even being so close to the supposedly bright sun. See, supposedly, because we're talking about light and what it really is and how we see it. Okay, so let's take what he said here and compare that to what is stated in this article. How does light travel from the sun to the earth? March 13, 2019 by Isaiah David. Talks a little bit about some of the stuff I reviewed with everyone yesterday. It's basically it says you have to understand what light is. Light is an electromagnetic wave, a wave of electric and magnetic energy oscillating very quickly. There are many different electromagnetic waves, and the type is determined by the speed of oscillation. Okay, now let's jump down here. Traveling through space, most waves require a medium to travel in. For example, if you drop a rock in a pond, it makes waves in the water. No water, no waves. Because light consists of photons, however, it can travel through space like a stream of tiny particles. The photons actually travel more quickly through space and lose less energy on the way because there are no molecules in the way to slow them down. Okay, now here's the key part. The atmosphere. Sky heavens. Or at least that the atmosphere is part of sky heavens. Sky heavens is everything with the atmosphere part. Notice what it says. When light travels through space from the sun, all of the frequencies of light travel in a straight line. When light hits the atmosphere, however, the photons begin to collide with gas molecules. Red, orange, and yellow photons have long wavelengths that can travel right through the gas molecules. Green, blue, and purple photons, however, have shorter wavelengths, which allows molecules to easily absorb them. The molecules hold onto the photon for only an instant, then shoot them out again in a random direction. This is why the sky looks blue. Many of these scattered photons fly toward the Earth, making the sky appear to glow. This is also why sunsets look red. At sunset, the photons have to travel through a larger layer of atmosphere before they reach our eyes. More of the higher frequency photons are absorbed, leaving layers of red, orange, and yellow. You understand where I'm going with this here? In other words, the sky heavens, remember what Job said? He said he was creating a space between the waters, and then there would be light that would come to be. And you're going to see that he describes light as having its source in the expanse. And he puts the luminaries in the sky heavens, obviously, but the light actually exists in the atmosphere of the sky part of our Earth. That's why, in order to contain light, he had to create the atmospheric layers, as we just saw described here, and then ultimately the sun and the moon that would shine on the Earth during different parts of day or night. Okay, but what happens is people, they lose it when it comes to, light being, the sky heavens or waters above the expanse. They think that because waters are above the expanse and because the light sources are in the expanse, that there's water above the sun and moon. It's just retarded. It's some of the dumbest thinking I've ever encountered when it comes to these subjects. Because the Bible does not describe things that way at all. It's just that when they talk about the sun and moon and the sky heavens and where they are, because people don't understand that the expanse includes all of the atmospheric layers, even above the watery layer of clouds, they think the expanse stops at the cloud layer or something. It's stupid. And so they just are misunderstanding what the text is referring to. Again, even in Psalm 148, it refers to the cloud layers as waters above the heavens. Well, he's not talking about the space heavens. He's talking about the heavens, the sky heavens, the mid-heaven, where birds fly, and the different layers up above them, up to the point where the clouds containing water reside. But the expanse goes all the way. It doesn't stop at the cloud layers. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why in Job 38:19, Job says, he asked Job where light resides. And it resides in the atmospheric layers of the expanse. That's where our light is, or where we get light from. Even if we're talking about the light traveling from the sun, it only becomes visible to us when it hits the expanse, and so that we can see it. But this idea that the sun and moon being in the expanse as sources of light, when in fact the light that comes from them isn't even what we see, but is seen when it hits the expanse part of our Earth's atmosphere, is ridiculous. The Bible does not limit the expanse that God creates as part of sky heavens here in Genesis to only going up to the watery layer of the clouds. Doesn't do that at all. The expanse is everything. The expanding universe. Everything. Space, all of it. It's just that when we're dealing with the text in Genesis and we're talking about the earth's layers and the waters, it's addressing the watery layers of the clouds above the expanse that's between the surface waters and the cloud waters. Just like we see today. And just like in Psalm 148:4, it says there's waters above the heavens. Well, do you think they thought there was water above the sun in Psalm 148:4? It's ridiculous. So you just have people they can't put 2 and 2 together and get 4. They get 5, they get 7. They may not even be able to answer it, right? They love the question. Oh man, it's disgusting. But they bring up these issues relative to these texts, and they're just naive to a point where I can't even deal with them anymore. They don't know what they're doing. They're basing it on things that seem implausible to them. They've not actually done any scientific evaluation. Let's take a look at that. We've been doing that. Let's look at the clouds now. How much clouds weigh? It's unbelievable. I have people actually thinking that gravity would pull down the amount of water that Jah put up into the cloud layers, even though we see millions of pounds of water above our heads today. It's ridiculous. But we have to deal with all kinds of people, I know. So here we go. They may look all light and fluffy, but the reality is that clouds are actually pretty heavy. Researchers have calculated that the average cumulus cloud, which is that nice white fluffy kind you see on a sunny day, weighs an incredible 1.1 million pounds. Well, so how is it not falling down on our heads all the time, right? Well, that's because there's more involved than just the weight of the cloud. So it says once you've worked out the density of the cloud, you need to work out how big it is, which is a measurement that also varies widely. Peggy Lamone, who led a lot of cloud weighing research at the U.S. National Center for Atmospheric Research, calculated that the average cumulus cloud is about 1 kilometer across and roughly has the shape of a cube. So it's as tall as it is wide. Now, the reason why this works the way it does is because weight isn't all concentrated in one point. And this is what the retards who seemingly can't figure out why all the waters above the firm expanse in Genesis aren't falling down or weren't falling down from gravity. It's because the weight isn't all concentrated in one point. And this is why I refer to them as retards. It's obviously, okay, you don't have to be a genius to understand this. It's obviously spread out over a huge space. Clouds are also made up of water droplets that are sometimes so tiny, gravity hardly has any effect on them. And because of condensation, clouds are actually buoyant. So all the Bible is doing is describing these very same conditions that exist today, but there's just more. And that's why we see all the water in the places that it is on the earth, in ice and under the surface. Notice here, perhaps even more surprising is the fact that a cloud is actually less dense than dry air. You see, so when you get people who make up these dumb, idiotic comments with no scientific information like I recently had done, and they create these questions and confusion just because they can't figure out these basic things, they're just not doing research, right? That's exactly why Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1:4 and said, just turn down these idiotic questions, okay? They're just going to make you go research things you already know, and that the people asking them are too lazy to research themselves. So we deal with that all the time. It's disgusting. People refuse to do their own research, and here it is right here, right? They just want me to do it for them, I guess. Either way, when the Bible refers to sky heavens, it's talking about the heavens, now inclusive of the conditions that Jah created so that water could exist above the surface of the earth's water, and so that light could exist and have its source in the firm expanse. Not because the sun and moon are below the watery layers of the cloud in that part of the expanse. The expanse goes all the way up past the cloud layer. And the stars and the sun and the moon are in that part. They're in the expanse above the watery cloud layer. But in another sense, they're actually in it, right? Because we see them in it. Because the distance that Jah set the sun and the moon from the earth, which allows for a perfect eclipse, by the way, is also what allows for light and heat to hit us at the times that it does. It takes about 8 seconds or so for light from the sun, or particles of light from the sun, to hit our atmosphere and become light for us to see. And it takes about 1.5 seconds for light reflecting off the moon to hit the earth, or so we can see it. But until it reaches our atmosphere, the atmospheric part of the firm expanse, it's not light. We can't see it. So the light source is in the atmospheric part of sky heavens for us. That's what Jah was designing. He made light as part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Then he created the sky heavens part of our earth, the atmospheric layers that allow for a separation of waters, and which allow for the containment of photons from the sun that then allow us to see light. And the sun and the moon are positioned so that they are actually visible to us in the sky, right? We can actually, it even refers to in Psalm 89:37 at the moon as a faithful witness in the skies. That's because sky heaven goes all the way up. For some reason, I don't know why, people limit this expanse that separates the waters to just between the waters. Why? That's not what creates the separation. It's the whole atmospheric equation. That is everything all the way up. Remember, the conditions aren't even set yet for the sun to erupt. That's why it's not here. He had to make the expanse first, which starts with the division of waters, the atmospheric layers of our earth, and then goes up into the rest of what we see as space. And that's when he creates, as we'll read in later texts, the luminaries that send forward these particles that, when they hit our atmosphere, allow us to see light. So there's no evidence at all, or any indication, that the firm expanse that leads to the division of waters is only between the waters. That's ridiculous. It doesn't say that at all. It doesn't indicate that at all. And even in Psalm 148, they were viewing waters above the heavens in terms of the division between the clouds and the surface water, but not above the sun. Oh man, the way people interpret these texts sometimes is amazing, but they're doing it all on their own. The Bible's not teaching that. The Bible doesn't limit the expanse to between the waters. The expanse above, the cloud layer of waters is in the expanse. It's in it. The expanse is holding it up above as clouds. And then the layers above that, which create the conditions that allow for the continuation of the different atmospheric layers. I'm going to go to, let's see, I'm going to show you an example from one of my papers here, where it kind of lists some of these different layers if you go to my Elihu online papers, as you know, I've written a subject, our paper on advanced Earth conditions, a response to Miller-Urey, and their whole paper Well, they wrote a couple papers, but either way, I'm referring to some specific experiments that were conducted in the late 40s, 50s. But if you look at the end, you see some different images. And so, okay, here is an image that I made that shows, basically, well, I didn't make this image, but I brought it in. The different layers of the Earth's atmosphere, okay? So the clouds are not up here in the exosphere, but this is all a part of the expanse. And so is all this, and all this, all of it. This is just the earthly part of the expanse. And here's the water on the earth. There are cloud layers in part of the expanse, and then the expanse goes up further above those cloud layers. There's even different layers of clouds in terms of their height. But the clouds are not the ceiling of the expanse. Remember, the expanse did not exist so as to create atmospheric conditions or clouds or water above the waters or the space beyond our atmosphere that allows for solar system, sun and moon and planets above. All the things that Job eventually put there. That's the expanse. It's just not the earthly atmospheric part of it. Okay, so I think that covers things pretty well in that regard. And let me see how we're doing on questions. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any questions as far as that goes, and that's good because I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't believe that it's necessary for us to interpret what the Bible says, as we'll get into in a little bit later. The sun and moon as like in the firmament between the cloud layer waters and the surface layer waters. That's not what it's talking about. The expanse did not exist in Genesis 1:1. The heavens and the earth existed. The heavens were there. They just didn't have the conditions yet in which you could put the sun and moon and all the stars. So once Job then created the expanse that allowed for waters to be divided in terms of surface waters and cloud layer waters, the expanse continued, as you can see in part in the image that I gave you from my paper, all the way up into space. So it doesn't make any sense to me why people believe that the expanse is only between the cloud layers and the earth. That's not taught in the Bible. That's not consistent with the way the Bible describes waters above the heavens in Genesis or in Psalm 148. And so when it comes to things like we're going to read about subsequently, the birds flying in the expanse, well, I mean, they're flying in the atmospheric part of the expanse that is designed for them to exist in. That's why the Bible in Revelation 19 refers to it as mid-heaven. And the Bible writers understood these different layers, at least to some extent, so that they could refer to clouds, waters above the heavens, birds in mid-heaven, but they didn't have the detailed knowledge of, how far up the expanse went that we do. So there's really no confusion at all with these biblical texts. Just like I find with pretty much everything else in the Bible, it's mostly people who confuse themselves, don't understand what the text is saying, or fail to do research about what things like light is and how light can be contained within the expanse and how luminaries can also be in the expanse and above the waters in the expanse and yet not actually be giving us light, but be sending us the particles that we see as light once they hit the expanse in our atmosphere. That's why Job made it that way, so that we could see. That's why he put those things there. It all follows consistently. There's no contradiction. There's nothing unusual about the language that is provided. It's just limited in terms of the extent to which the people writing about these things are learning from Jah about what took place, or sons of God as they may have existed before the flood, could not really fully understand the extent of which we can today. But the expanse is not limited between the cloud layers and the surface waters. That's a made-up idea. Nothing in the Bible says that. The expanse is what Jah created to divide the waters, to allow for light to be contained so that we could see everything, and to exist continuously above our earth so that he could put in it sun, moon, and stars. That's what it teaches. It's very clear, and there's really no controversy at all to me. That's why when people make controversies about it, I don't have much patience for them. Unless they're really young and naive, that's fine. We've all been there. But if you've studied these issues for very long and you've taken them seriously and you still don't understand, then, there's nothing we can do for you. You just don't get it, or you don't agree, and we do. We get it and we agree. What else do you want us to do, right? We're not going to argue with you continuously. I've tried to break it down as simply as I can. I've tried to show you from the Greek and Hebrew text what Genesis is talking about. It's all very consistent in my view. We just don't have sky heavens in Genesis 1:1, and then we do. And then the sky heavens is used to divide the waters, allow for light, all the stuff we just reviewed. So I hope that helps you. My goal is to educate you and give you information that will benefit you and help you when dealing with people who really don't know what's going on. They're learning, they're new. Not like these apologetic nut jobs or people who've just wasted their whole life because they can't figure out a simple text that talks about a firm expanse and waters above and below it. Just like we have today, right? And it's like you talk to them, it's like, how could that happen? Oh, I don't know. It happens every day. So what are you talking about? We can't help people like that. Not that we don't want to. It's just there's nothing we can do to assist someone with that level of basic information or basic inquiry that should precede conclusions or comments, especially if they're disparaging toward other people's views. All right? You have to actually know what you're talking about if you want people to respect you. And if you want to put down the Bible because you think there's a contradiction with these things, that's up to you. But that's not what we choose to do, because we don't see a contradiction. We've read the texts, translated the texts, cross-referenced the text with other texts, and compared it with what we know scientifically to be true, something we can test and observe. Yet we have people that will continually state that there's a problem with this firm expanse in the sun and moon. Where? Where's the problem? There is none. It's an imagination by people who've created, literally, a cloud ceiling for the firm expanse. So, I hope that's been beneficial to you. We will get into the waters above the expanse, or the more dense or more water-filled layer of clouds that preceded the flood, as we get to the discussion of the flood and the descriptions that it gives in Genesis about the cloud layers and the water and the gates of heaven breaking open. And of course, we also have the deep springs from the earth sending out water, according to the account, which no one back then would have even known about. But we know about them now. I'll present that information to you when we get to that discussion. How did they know there was that much water breaking open, unless that's actually what happened, right? Because the people with Noah and all those, they would have seen water bursting up from the surface of the earth as well, not just as it rained. That's not what the Bible describes only. So we'll get into that further, but I hope I've helped you understand the firm expanse better, that it is sky heavens inclusive of everything, including the Genesis 1:1 heavens. But now, having been prepared and made so that there's atmospheric layers and conditions in space that allow for the cloud layer, the containment of light in the Earth's atmosphere, and the placement of the sun, moon, and stars exactly like the Bible describes. So we'll talk more about it in our continuing day text readings. I don't see any significant questions here. I think we covered it well. We'll talk about the waters more, as I mentioned. And I think that's mainly what you need to keep in mind, that the firm expanse is not limited to the cloud layer, the watery layer over the earth. It's just a more dense or water-filled layer of clouds like we see today. So I don't know why people get so confused and stumbled over it. Obviously, it was more dense in ways we can't relate to at this point, and the conditions of the earth have changed because of all the water that has been released. But what it describes is not inconsistent with what we still see today in terms of the division of waters above and below and the space in between. So I hope that helps. I look forward to joining you all again Monday for another day text. I don't know if I'm going to do a Sunday show tomorrow. I might. I have a couple ideas. I've just been doing a lot of different things. I wanted to get these day text readings going. A lot of Genesis stuff. I got a lot of work too. I'm busy with work. But I may do a show tomorrow, either an open session or CW Job Talk 22. I just have to make sure I'm going to be able to get it done right. So we'll see. Be aware or look on the lookout for the notice as far as what I'm going to do on Sunday tomorrow. And then continue considering these texts, the material and information that I provided. I'll put some links below to the sites that I brought us to and shared with you so that you can review them on your own. But I find all of this information consistent. I don't see any problem. And in fact, I see deep wisdom. I see descriptions of things that would only be done by those who had an understanding of what was taking place, because it's entirely consistent with what we see today. So I thank you all for joining me. I look forward to going through Genesis more with you and discussing these texts. And then, like I said, we'll see what I can get together for tomorrow for our Sunday show. So with that in mind, I'll either see you all tomorrow or Monday for our next day text.